backtrack and retell those stories,
right,
so that people can see how these relationships play out, how people contribute or don't contribute to the food system. And so all of these things are at play at any given moment when we're taking a bite to eat, when we're going to the grocery store. These are all very subtle messages that reinforce a structure that doesn't value relationship.
absolutely. And it becomes insidious, this siloed thinking where we separate everything and we get down to the minutia of data and collection and measuring things. And it makes us all sort of forget what you said, which is that interconnectedness. And I also really appreciate what you had to say about storytelling. We have to, retell these stories and bring the truth back to them. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how the First Nations Development Institute works to tell those stories, to amplify the work of Indigenous leaders and make sure that their stories of connecting planetary health with human health are heard and then acted upon.
I really appreciate the shout out to First Nations, and I do believe I have like the best job in all of the world because I get to work with Indigenous people working on food and ag projects. But I do have to say, like, I am the least important part of the storytelling or like the whole process. I say that often because we just like get to fund these projects, but the people doing the work and the people telling the stories and the people who like know what their lands need are really should be the focus.
Sure.
And we just get to fund them. But at the same time, like, it's really not about us. Like, we don't try to insert the Indigenous story into all the conversations because they are like standalone. These are stories that have withstood the test of time and like colonization and all these assaults on how we think about food, how we think about people, how we think about our planet, how we think about each other. And it's almost like we're just cultivating the garden bed for the time when people are ready for those stories, because regardless of what is happening outside of Indigenous community, Indigenous people continue to honor these covenants that they have with each other and their people. And at First Nations, we just get to participate in cultivating that for the time when people are ready to, like, for the bloom, for the harvest. And so I love my job. Thank you for acknowledging First Nation.
No, and I'm so glad to hear all that. I like the idea of cultivating the garden bed so that those stories can grow, that they can be told when the time is right and ripe for them to be told. And I think so much of that we've seen over the last year is we need to hear these stories and we need to hear, again, the truth. Jose, if I can shift gears a little bit and turn to you now. Again, over the last year, we've talked about the essentialness of food and farm workers. And again, it's only over the last year that I think many of us as eaters understood how much we depend on food and farm workers. And I'm wondering how we can enforce, again, this idea of interconnectedness and make sure that we don't forget as we come out of the pandemic, how crucial these folks are to our daily lives and that they deserve our respect and they deserve a living wage and they deserve so much more than what they've been given.
First of all, thank you, Danny, for having me, and really thanks to A-dae for her comments, because I think it frames perfectly not just our work, but I think the work that we all should be doing, which is really about busting down these silos, right? We can't think of just health in the silo as it pertains to food, as if that didn't have anything to do with policy or with workers or with the earth, right? Like, these are all very deeply interconnected issues that if taken just one at a time, it's that old adage of squeezing the balloon, right? You squeeze one end and the other end pops. So yeah, so to answer your question, I think, when we first started, I'm a restaurant worker for a very long time, and I realized that we were only going to change the conditions in my workplace if I band together with other workers. That led us to create this organization, and that led to a broader organization of food workers throughout the entire food system which together before the pandemic were about 21.5 million, right? It was the biggest sector in the economy, and also the lowest paid, right? And those two things kind of don't jive, right? Especially once you start calling them essential workers and all this other stuff, and also paying the minimum wage or lower than minimum wage in the case of farm workers, or in the case of restaurant workers, where you have a sub-minimum wage that is legally allowed. Anyway, so to us, it was a matter of bringing all of those folks together and then realizing that that wasn't even enough, right? Like bringing the farm workers with the restaurant workers, with the warehouse workers, even all of that wasn't enough, that we needed to actually go across those the silo of labor, and talk to folks that were doing work around what food does to the human body in terms of nutrition and health, and what food does to the environment in terms of waste and production. And that is essentially the genesis of the HEAL Food Alliance. The HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. And that's really what the point of HEAL is right, to break down those silos and to make sure that we're looking at the food system holistically and not just in a particular impact or effect.
Absolutely. It all goes back to this interconnectedness. And I'm so glad you brought up policy, because that often gets left out of these conversations, because we do need better policies for protecting food and farm workers, for what, I mentioned before about a better wage, a living wage, or, a fair wage for what they actually do. How do we create the environment for these policies to become more widespread? I mean, you saw all this sort of, concern about food and farm workers 6 months ago. I'm not seeing the same sort of thing now, right? And so how do we make sure that policies are actually being put in place that will protect these folks, whether there's a pandemic or not?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic highlighted the reality for a lot of food workers, especially meat sector workers and restaurant workers, right, who all had a very, very direct impact. And I think part of what we need to do is sort of remember what that was like, right? And realize that were it not for those folks, many of us would not have even survived, right? It would have been very, very difficult for us to live. And so, yeah, so I think the idea of separating policy from the reality of what people are living is fictional, right? Like we really do have to realize that we live in a political world, and the politics of policy are essential if we're going to actually have a world eventually that's going to be sustainable, and that's going to be caring, and that's going to actually go across many generations. We have to make sure that we have policies that correspond to that vision of the world, right? So yeah, that includes passing the PRO Act in Congress as a must do, because the only way that workers are heard on their jobs is if their organizations are respected, and those organizations are unions in the most part. And secondly, looking at the Wage Act, which eliminates the sub-minimum wage in the restaurant industry. And then thirdly, I think looking at how do we amend both the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act so that we get rid of that exclusion for agricultural workers. Right. That exclusion, for many of you who are not familiar with it, basically is rooted in slavery, and it has an undertone of agricultural workers not being the same as other workers, right? In other words, you can pay them less than minimum wage. You can have child labor. As a matter of fact, it is completely normal to see 12, 13-year-olds working in the fields. And you can do that legally, right? It's not an illegal thing that the employers do behind the scenes. It's completely legal for that to happen. And that's because these workers are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which are the two bodies of law that protect workers against retaliation in the case of union organizing, child labor, overtime laws, minimum wage, right? The basic laws that protect us in the workplace.
Yeah, there's so much to do, but I'm glad you mentioned this idea of a caring economy, a caring world, because I think that's essential to making sure that policy actually works for people. I want to turn back to you both now. And, whenever we have these sorts of events, we can't include everyone, especially when it's only an hour long. And as organizations like the Danone Institute North America and Food Tank move forward on working to highlight different initiatives and amplify different voices, we need to be as inclusive as possible. And I'm wondering, how do your organizations, how does the HEAL Food Alliance and how does First Nations Development Institute really practice inclusivity daily as part of that work? A-dae, maybe you want to go first?
Sure. Well, First Nations is dedicated to the empowerment of Indigenous tribal people across the mainland, Hawaii, and Alaska. And contrary to popular belief, there's a lot of diversity in tribal communities. When we think about 576 tribal communities now, I think we have 500 plus the unrecognized communities plus the Native nonprofit world. So we have a wide community that we try to reach. And we do have diversity in the projects. We have folks that are focused on traditional agriculture who want nothing to do with the capitalist system. But we have also agribusinesses, tribes who really are trying to build up food hubs or their own enterprises around food that they're growing. I mean, there's so much diversity in Indigenous America that we could probably talk about diversity for, because there's such a vast array of characters, of people, of projects, and we're so happy to be part of all of those things.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining all that. I think there is a lot of misconception about what Native communities look like and who they are. So thanks for sort of myth busting all of that. That's really helpful. Jose, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think for food workers and for the food system in general, I think we have to look at the frontline communities, and that being the folks who are most directly impacted by the ill effects of the food system, as the ones who should and do have the solutions for the problems in the food system. And so making sure that they are at the center of decision-making when we are actually proposing solutions, right? When we're going forward, for instance, with legislation to Congress or that kind of thing, that's critical. And so for us at HEAL, it was really important to make sure that BIPOC communities, that Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities were the ones that were centered in the decision-making processes towards these solutions. And so most of the steering committee and most of our staff are BIPOC folks, and that gives us, I think, a really clear sense, since we're rooted in our communities, of which direction we need to move in. I think it's really critical for organizations, especially the organizations that are primarily white organizations, to not just stand in solidarity with the folks who are leading the fight in BIPOC communities, but who can actually place those folks in the leadership of their work, right? That to me is the critical sort of the swing of the pendulum and
yeah,
really the shift that we need to start promoting in all of our work.
Thank you. That, again, very, very good advice, very well said, and so important to do. And these are really tough decisions for a lot of organizations, but they need to be made. And, and Food Tank is among them. So thank you for all of that. I think that's really helpful. Again, for you both, I may be ending this panel on sort of what advice we can give our listeners and our viewers about making food choices that really reflect the values of one planet, and really, help people make the connections, connect the dots between what they eat and who it affects and how it impacts the environment. And so, Jose, maybe you go first for maybe 30 seconds, a piece of advice. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I do think there are a lot of ways that folks can impact the food system in just the choices that they make with the food that they buy. But I do think more importantly than that is actually supporting the work that local organizations are doing to transform the food system.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Our voting with our wallet adage is important as part of a broader strategy. It is not in and of itself a strategy, right? So it has to be understood as a contextual piece, right? So if you have a local campaign that's intending to pass, for instance, the Good Food Purchasing Policy, which is a multi-sector health, environment, animal welfare, local economies, and labor transformation of the public procurement system, food procurement system, that's the effort that should be focused on, right? And yes, then the purchasing is not just for you individually, right? The purchasing is for all of the kids of your local school district, right? Or all of the money that your public libraries are using on food, right? That kind of thing. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. So A-dae, you get the last word. What advice would you give our listeners and our viewers about how to make those connections that we've been talking about, and really, you know, as Jose said, vote with their wallets, but also vote with their votes on how to make a better food system?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think we all as individuals have to question the role that gives us this idea that as individuals we can change the food system. Because as Jose said, like, when you're looking at strategies that are dependent on market solutions, you're kind of reinforcing a market system. And so if we think of ourselves as like change makers with our wallet, we're still within this market system. But we have to realize, you know, we're breaking down barriers. It's not just about individuals. It's not just about our own health and our own pantry and our own table. Like, we have to think in terms of community. What does your community look like? What kind of community are you part of? If you're not part of one, find one. Because really the only way we're going to change the American food system is recognize that it's not dependent on individual market behaviors. It's dependent on community empathy, responsibility, and response.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for highlighting all that. And I want to thank both Jose and A-dae for joining us today. I think this was such a great start to this conversation. Thank you to you both. And for our viewers and listeners, I am trying to weave in some of your comments and your questions into the conversation. So keep them coming. I'm looking when I can and trying to get to them. I'm now so excited to introduce our next panel on One Health. We have Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, the Dean of Tufts University Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy. And I'm so glad that he is joined by Tambra Raye Stevenson, the CEO and founder of WANDA, which stands for Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. Thank you both so much for joining me today. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. One of our favorite alumni from the Friedman School.
Thank you so much. That's very kind. So Dari, I do want to start with you. Since I was a graduate student at Tufts, I've been puzzled and completely confused about how and why we ignore nutrition, or why it's siloed, as we sort of talked about in the first discussion, when we're making decisions around food and agriculture policy. And again, perhaps the pandemic is changing that, but why has nutrition been so siloed over the years? And how can we make sure that it's fully integrated into practice and policy from now on?
Well, you know, of course, we're talking about the major industrial, agricultural system. You know, smallholder farmers around the world are thinking about nutrition when they're planting, farms for their own families. But large scale agriculture was created in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, very, very consciously and very specifically to prevent mass starvation. And so that was the huge concern at the time. And so the Green Revolution and all of that industry was all about production. Production was the goal. And the estimates were that 1 billion people might starve by the end of the 20th century. And so that was prevented. And in fact, true caloric hunger has greatly decreased on this planet, even with an explosion of population. If you look at those population curves, right after 1800, it's incredible. So that was a success, and we shouldn't discount that and blame agriculture for doing what it intended to do. But it missed the rise or didn't predict the incredible rise in chronic diseases, diabetes and obesity in particular, that I think are very directly related to that monocropping and creation of production agriculture, production livestock, production starchy staples, rather than more nutrient rich, more diverse foods. And so that's changing, and it's changing because of millennials. It's changing because of consumers. It's changing because of some companies, recognizing it's the right thing to do, and governments. And so I hope, just like climate is now recognized as so central in agriculture, nutrition has to be there too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tambra, let me turn to you, and women, and particularly BIPOC women, Black, Indigenous, people of color women, have been siloed when we are talking about nutrition and advancing nutrition and nutrient dense foods. But their voices are so essential when we're coming up with solutions. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how WANDA, which again is Women Advancing Dietetics, Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, how can we break down those silos that we've been talking about throughout this discussion?
Most definitely. Thank you so much. When in the creation of WANDA, I really looked at what was missing. I had, at the time, was working in international nutrition spaces, addressing policy issues in Africa and in Asia, and how to build up policy systems in these countries and continents. And it dawned on me that so much energy, as we are in the midst of the UN food systems dialogues that have been high level and not focused at the community and local level. And that was a missed opportunity in recognizing that we have everyday women and girls who are leading households, leading farms, leading their communities, that I call the hidden food figures in the food system that must be amplified and elevated. And so WANDA was really born out of this love to help heal our community by inspiring and engaging and informing women and girls to honor their ancestors, to embrace our food ways, to heal our communities, to heal ourselves, and become these healthy food change makers, entrepreneurs, and leaders, and advocating for the healthy food policies that our communities deserve. And so I have broke down WANDA beyond just Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, but also W for the wisdom of hearing our ancestors and being guided on this journey. A for being authentic in this path as we walk and talk our mission, and to be nourishing of our minds, our bodies, and spirits, of reaffirming this self-love, and to be determined to dig deep within and be rooted and grounded, and to remain still in the spirit of this work, which truly is ministry, and to arise above the trials and tribulations that may come forward and spread our wings and to bear fruit in our communities. This is the work of women. This is the work of working on behalf of Mama Africa, Mama Earth. And we have to remember this divine feminine power that we have within that complements this system that was built not with us centered in mind.
Absolutely. And I'm not glad about it, but I'm glad that you mentioned missed opportunities. There's so many missed opportunities when we're talking about women's role in the food system, that we don't respect and honor them enough, in the same way that we haven't respected food and farm workers. And again, it goes back to green revolution policies that really, separated people from the land and separated them from their ancestral knowledge. So bringing that all back and honoring it is one of the things that I like most about your work.
Thank you so much. And part of it is understanding that we are missing values-based leadership. Coming out of Tufts Med at a time where social entrepreneurship was booming in Boston and becoming a lifetime member of Net Impact, I really caught the bug of social entrepreneurship, of what it means to align people, planet, and profit together. And I said, how can we incorporate this belief into the area of nutrition? And how do we begin operationalizing and concretizing this in our everyday communities? And so I set a mission with our team, WANDA, around how to redefine values-based leadership at the local and global level that we're all connected. And it is a number of C's. I like to talk like an advertiser, but being committed to the power of changing the trajectory of our communities, caring enough to empower ourselves and our families, conscious enough of the colonial tactics to subvert communal restoration, cultivating a power of healing culture, and connected to this power of sisterhood, because it goes beyond just diversity and inclusion and equity, but a sense of belonging, and being concerned enough to shift the power of the food and health system, because they're all connected, and being concerned enough and contributing to the power of positive impact in our communities and family. And lastly, understanding the power of cooking, which is becoming a lost art form, as a way of documenting and writing our rich recipes of our ancestors by honoring our heritage and celebrating it. It's so vitally important.
It is so vitally important. I love that you're branding it in such creative ways. I think that's what we need. It helps people remember and it helps get people interested. So kudos to you. Dari, I want to go back to you because you have such a high level leadership role in the food and nutrition community, and you are so well known, and you've worked with folks like former Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman around things like, writing terrific op-eds that highlight, that improving American nutrition would have the biggest impact on our healthcare, lowering costs, of course, improving quality of life. And again, we've certainly seen that during the pandemic, those who are well-nourished and those who, have the ability to afford really good food and have access to it fared better than those who weren't. And I'm wondering how we make that, that health link back to the environment that we spoke about earlier. How do we make sure that people understand those connections?
Well, I'm optimistic. I mean, we're at a special moment in time when first, we've reaped the benefits of the Green Revolution, but now see that wasn't everything we wanted to do in food, and widely recognize, I think, that we need to shift the food system, and that's very positive. And I want to come back to what Tambra said. I really agree with her on business innovation and entrepreneurship, and Tufts has launched the Food and Nutrition Innovation Institute, and I'm proud to say WANDA is a member of that. It includes nonprofits, investors, small companies, big companies across the food system, and including health as well, healthcare, pharma, to try to think about innovation in the space. And I think innovation is going to be the solution. We can innovate our agricultural system, but to do that, we need first research and science to know what to do, because we can't just say we're going to do it. Research and science is crucial. And I'll pause there for a second to say COVID-19 has really shown, I think, everyone how you need science. And there was, for maybe 10 years before COVID-19, this slow drift away from and diminishing of science as though it weren't important. Science is crucial. So we need good science. And then we need investment, and we need investment in that science to make it happen. And so, for example, I'd love to see the USDA, under the fantastic leadership of Secretary Vilsack, who's really talking about nutrition security a lot. I'd love to see him direct the USDA that all research and production must be linked to nutrition security, nutrition equity, and sustainability. Those should be the three pillars of all production research coming out of USDA. I'd love to see NIH, with its focus on health, work closely with USDA. So I think the US needs to have a new $1 billion a year research investment in nutrition, agriculture, production, sustainability, equity. $1 billion a year is nothing on the scale of these costs. And then secondly, we need to encourage investment in this. And so I think that's, again, where the government has a role to reward companies who are doing the right thing, whether it's through tax policy, opportunity zones legislation for investing in low-income communities, rewarding B Corporation status. I think there's a lot of ways that the government can sort of help with carrots and sticks as needed, reward innovation in this space.
Well, I mean, you mentioned being optimistic, but when you look at USDA and FDA and Health and Human Services, you mentioned NIH, these are all very siloed organizations. And, I try to be hopeful and optimistic. And I think, with this new administration, there are all these opportunities to unsilo them. But that's a very big load, especially after the last 4 years, when a lot of these agencies had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. So I'm wondering how we break down those silos and get those agencies working together. I didn't mention USAID. That's another important one. There are a million others I'm forgetting.
Well, I think you've actually hit the nail on the head for the number one reason this hasn't happened yet. It's not industry pressure or, corrupt politicians, or it's just everybody's so busy. Everybody's working in their own silos, working really hard to try to fix things, but not doing it in a coordinated way. It's just that simple. There's no food and nutrition coordinated agency in the US government. The USDA is predominantly focused on increasing production because that's been their mandate. And so we identified that in this report that you mentioned that was co-written by Senator Tom Harkin, Secretary Dan Glickman, and outstanding experts, many other outstanding experts, David Kessler. We noticed that this is a huge problem. And the last time the federal government took a coordinated look at nutrition was in 1969, the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, Health that was organized by Jean Mayer, who went on to found our school, and I'm the Jean Mayer professor at Tufts, so it's a big shoes to try to fit into. That was the last time. And so we've called for two things. One is a second White House conference in early 2022. We should have a second White House conference, bring in all the stakeholders, figure this out. We can figure this out. We have the ability and the technology and the know-how to do this. And secondly, we need to create a new leadership position within the US government that leads food and nutrition policy moving forward. After September 11th, Congress realized that one of the reasons that we didn't act appropriately to prevent September 11th was the fragmentation of the national intelligence apparatus, and they created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which has been very successful. COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters are a much bigger than September 11th moment, right? That's a September 11th moment for our food system. And so it's time to create an Office of the National Director of Food and Nutrition, like the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which puts a leader in the White House who has her touch on all of the pulses of all these issues across the agencies. And the Government Accountability Office, which is the US watchdog, is coming out with a report sometime later this year. I haven't seen it, but they've been working on this for 2 years, looking at all of the challenges in food policy in the US government. And so the US government is auditing its own food policy. And I think, I'm going to guess that one of their conclusions is going to be this lack of coordination.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this idea of an Office of National Food and Nutrition. I think that, that's been a long time coming. Tambra, Dariush mentioned this idea of both innovation and investment that's needed to really advance nutrition and, this idea of nutrient dense foods. And one of the things that I've been inspired about over the last several years is how many dietitians and nutritionists are becoming interested in environmental sustainability and, working to include that and deliver those messages to their clients. And it goes back to this idea of how do we break down the silos and create that interconnectedness that Jose and A-dae talked about, so that those folks who are working professionally to feed people well understand the impacts on the environment.
Most definitely. I am one of those folks, and partly being trained in public health at Tufts truly helped to broaden my lens of understanding these social determinants of nutrition, that it's not enough to pop a pill or to have your food in the form of an MRE, that we truly must understand the connectedness to the earth, the planet, the environment of where our food is derived from. And to eat a mostly plant-based diet is critical. And I recognize the dilemmas in the conversation in the global South around this issue as well. But the idea of even the double pyramid concept that Food Tank is even highlighted is something that we should be mindful of. How can we incorporate this within our cultures? And so in the field of nutrition, we talk about, if nutrition is your passion, policy must be your business. And I think in amplifying the voices of the points that Dariush has pointed out is critical, and to understand that if we truly understand that this work, this ministry is building a movement, how do we use every possible platform and policy structures in place to help raise and transform? Yes, we are all busy people, but we could either be digging ourselves closer to the grave or digging ourselves to freedom. And I try to lean on the freedom side. My friend in my head is Harriet Tubman. And so for me, I think about how democratizing nutrition is critical to this aspect. And that means, how do we give power to the people, the planet, and the plants? They all work together. And by doing that, we look at the issue of equity. Equity is the heart of this conversation when we look at the structural issues that build a broken food system to begin with. How do we now dismantle or recreate a new food system with planet and people in mind? And that means we have to realize that media plays a role. We must create content and have leadership that helps to paint a new editorial agenda. We must have policymakers that have the wherewithal, the audaciousness to develop policies that help destruct disabling environments that have been divested communities historically, like mine of Anacostia in Washington, D.C., and that we must recognize that the policies that are currently in place are sometimes the Band-Aid whitewash language used to only perpetuate poverty pimping, or what a Belgian professor once said, humanitarian imperialism, that we have a poverty industry that supports this idea of just doing enough with a very little, but we must recognize the billion that Dari talked about. Our industry of food in DC pre the pandemic, when we did our food economy report in DC Food Policy Council, was already at 6 billion. This is just the district. We're not even a state. We're still fighting for statehood in this country. And so if we're looking to understand what these small investments in nutrition, as the Scaling Up Nutrition Initiative have already shared, $1 in nutrition investments turn into $16 of return. That impacts the academic performance of our children, mine included. It impacts the workplace productivity of those who are coming back out of this pandemic, hopefully highlighting the food insecurity issues that the pandemic has highlighted. It impacts the national security of this country, having been a national security scholar who understands that if you want a group of troops ready to fight for our freedom, they must be fit, and our food plays a critical role in that investment. And so all of this goes to say that we must understand that we play a role, whether we're a nutritionist or a dietitian. We must have an Academy of Nutrition Dietetics calling out racism. We must dismantle this system. And if we can acknowledge the problem and get the proper diagnosis, we cannot come up with a proper prognosis. And that's where we have the issue at right now.
Fantastic. I love this idea of dismantling and building back better. I love that you said power to people, planet, and plants. These are all really great. I know. I'm just like, I have so many notes here. I want to thank you both for such an amazing discussion. You're both such amazing leaders and have made this discussion even richer. Thank you to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
And I think this is a great lead in to our next discussion. I'd like to welcome our next two panelists who will share a bit more about the One Planet, One Health grant program. I'm really delighted to welcome Diane Moss, the CEO of Project New Village in San Diego. Project New Village, along with San Diego State University and UC San Diego, were awarded the Danone Institute One Planet, One Health Initiative grant in 2019. And I was able to hear more about their progress a few weeks ago. And it's a really inspiring group of people who are creating food justice and community revitalization for more than 200,000 residents in the San Diego metropolitan area. And I'm also really pleased to introduce Leslie Lytle, the president of Danone Institute North America and a professor of the Gillian School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So Leslie, I just want to begin with you. Can you give us a brief overview of Danone Institute North America and this One Planet, One Health initiative?
Yeah, sure. First, Danny, thanks so much. This has been such an interesting panel, such a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate Food Tank and your help in pulling this all together. The Danone Institute of North America is actually one of several Danone Institutes created worldwide by the Danone Food Company. It's a separately incorporated 501c3 nonprofit foundation dedicated to non-commercial activities. So that's who we are at Danone Institute North America. Our One Planet, One Health initiative was launched in 2019 to reflect Danone's belief that the health of the planet and the health of people are inseparable. And the goal of our initiative is to foster transdisciplinary, community-based work in the United States and Canada to promote sustainable food systems. So throughout this panel, we've been hearing a lot about reducing silos and the importance of working in community. And I think our initiative really reflects this growing acknowledgement that we can't, that to try to solve complex problems in community and not engage community is not going to work.
Right.
And so we've also really realized that working in our disciplinary silos of nutrition, agriculture, economy, sociology, that's not worked either.
Mm-hmm.
So the goal of our initiative is really to break down those silos and to connect community with other thought leaders to provide an opportunity for innovative, local, community-based initiatives. In our thought, you know, we've been hearing a lot about policy, and certainly there's an important role at the federal level for food policy. But with our initiative, we're believing that in addition to top-down approaches, that bottom-up approaches will really be helpful too. So playing on and taking advantage of the passion of local people in their communities and helping them become the thought leaders and the innovators to improve their own communities, we believe is a way to reflect the need and to instigate growth and progress in this important area.
Sure. And what I was impressed by, I mentioned that I was on a phone call with many of the groups involved a few weeks ago, and that, you know, these folks are already thought leaders. What the grants that they're getting from Danone Institute North America and other groups help them do is, you know, really amplify that message. And it's so interesting to me that these bottom-up approaches, while starting small, can have such a huge impact and eventually influence policy and make things happen in bigger ways. And I was impressed by how the different communities, whether it's in Minneapolis or in San Diego where Diane lives, are able to learn from one another. And I think that's a huge part of what this initiative does. And then Leslie, just finally, you know, you gave out these grants in 2019, and then a few months later, the pandemic hit, and the best laid plans of all of these folks sort of went awry, but they were able to pivot in really interesting ways.
Yes, they were. I mean, it was for all of us a really challenging year. But I think one of the things that all four of our teams that were funded in 2019 realized is the importance of looking for community solutions when a crisis hits. And I believe all four of our funded teams really did a really nice job of pivoting and doing the very best that they could under the circumstances. You know, for example, even though in Minneapolis, we had not only the pandemic, but we had the crisis of George Floyd, our Minneapolis team was able to construct and promote 2 passive solar greenhouses. And through that project, not only achieve some goals around growing local foods, but also creating a different kind of sense of community asset and power, which was incredibly important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you
think
so much.
Diane will talk much more about all the fantastic work that she's done in San Diego.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Diane, you know a lot about pivoting, especially over the last year and a half. And you and your team were awarded the grant in 2019 for your initiative, which is called Bringing Gardening into the Good Food District, Increasing Gardeners' Capacity Through a Regenerative Community of Practice, which is a title I love. And so I'm wondering if you can talk more about the program and what you've been able to accomplish.
Sure. And thank you for this opportunity to share. So when Project New Village is a community-rooted organization, and one of the tenets we follow early on was social determinants of health. So that's already looking at the connectedness of the environment, the food, the people. But what we wanted to highlight is that you have to have an active role in changing your space. And when I saw the one planet, I'm like, this is our particular space on this planet, right? So it's a geographically defined space, which has all of the challenges, if you will, of where the majority of BIPOC people live. Let me just put it that way. And so the core here is hyper-local and investing in where you live. So this was allowing us to look and talk to people about, we can grow our own food. Some of the assets in our community are the people in the spaces. We got enough vacant lots, right? And people who have a connection to agriculture to do something differently and change our space. So that's really how we got into looking at establishing the grower, because San Diego, everything is done through a committee, a collaboration, and sometimes we're just not at the table. So how we amplify our voice is at the community level, saying this is important, let us invest, so that then we can go out and connect with other resources we need, because we don't have everything we need, but we need to start and we need to make the ask and the demand. So I think that's how we got started with this initiative. It resonated with us, we could do this. And we already had a wonderful cross-sector partnership, leadership with many of the universities at the table. In fact, this opportunity was brought up to us, one of our academic partners.
One of the things that I find inspiring about the project is the sense of empowerment, because you're creating this environment where the community recognizes the assets that are already there. You're not necessarily creating all these new assets. It's recognizing the value that's inherent already in the community. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because there's so much intellectual, there are so many intellectual assets. There's so many sort of, community organizing assets. These are all things that were already there that you just sort of brought together in a creative way.
Yeah. So this is not our first dance with an inequitable system, right? Everywhere that you hear about food injustice, these are the communities that are seen as communities of concern, right? And so we have a variety of issues and challenges. And so we are familiar with the pathway of community change and being systems folks through our heritage, through the people whose shoulders that we stand on. So we need to be a catalyst and activate that memory, right? And make the connections so that we can be better. We can be our own source of self-determining resources in the community, not just what people think you should have or what they allocate to you, but your own voice based on your own experience. So we act as a catalyst for that type of spirit, always emphasizing the solutions, what we can do, because clearly on the news every day we hear what we can't do. Sure. So let's shape our own narrative and tell that story.
Yeah, I love that. And that's crucial for communities to not just survive through a crisis like the pandemic, but to actually thrive each and every day, whether there's a pandemic or a climate crisis or whatever else, or a conflict. It really, like again, I find it so inspiring that you're building this thriving community that, again, they're not just getting by day to day, that they're actually thriving. And I think that's wonderful. When I heard you speak a few weeks ago, Diane, with the other grantees, you said something that really struck me. And it was this idea of creating a food system and a food environment that means people will never have to wait in line for food. And along with the images of food workers and food processing workers on the front lines of the pandemic that Jose spoke about, the other image that really sticks out for many Americans or many North Americans is the long lines for food banks. And I'm wondering if you can explain how this good food district and the hub you're creating and the community of activists and organizers you're creating can help make sure that there's more accessibility and affordability for good, healthy food for residents.
Okay, I appreciate the question. So we start with ourselves as growers, and then if you're growing food, you're either eating, you're a consumer, or you're sharing. We wanted to make other opportunities in our neighborhood. We've had what we call mini miracles. We have very little staff, lots of relationships, and when opportunities come our way, we try to make the most of them. We recently bought some property in the city of San Diego. We want to turn that into a hub. So if you're growing food, we can increase our employment, our activity around aggravation, processing, building a mobile farmers market so that our neighborhood is a working class neighborhood. We might not make it out to a farmers market once a week for a few hours, but if I get a mobile market, I can be somewhere every day and I can make sure it's 100% dedicated to this community. And we're selling the things that we grow and the added value products. So it's really looking at, we've got opportunities that we haven't done. We can do this. People have done it before us. People are doing it in other places. Let's take the example and make it happen here. So with the hub, it becomes a centralized place that's connected to businesses, that's connected to entrepreneur learning, the job, so we don't say job, pipeline for work around the food industry. And we have everything that we need, or most of the things we need here. We're going to ask others to invest because clearly capital is not what we have, but social capital and spaces and a desire and hope, we've got that. So maximizing what we can do.
Absolutely. All of those things are there, but the investment and the capital are what's needed. You have everything else you need to be successful. So can you talk a little bit about how the grant, the 2019 grant from the One Planet, One Health initiative helped, create some of the opportunities that are now taking place?
So absolutely. Again, it allowed us an opportunity to bring centerfold the process or the importance of the person, the grower, right? And then it gave us training on how to get the message out to others, right? We did really well in terms of the broader community, looking and seeing what we could do, and then people claiming a lane or a space where they could help. Where we need to move further is how do we further go deeper into our community and get the message out there? But clearly, the One Planet, One Health, One Planet initiative looked at how do we amplify our voice? How do we use social media? How do we use these different networks to get our message to others? Not necessarily changing the message, but the opportunities that we can make to get that message out to others. We do need talent. We do need resources from others. And after all, this is the whole planet, and we want to bring some attention to our particular space on this planet.
I love it. Leslie, Diane mentioned, training, and I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about how the grant program includes those other components. It's not just like, hey, here's some money. It's,
Right.
There's mentorship and training and communications and outreach and those kinds of things.
Yeah. So we built training into the initiative. And we did it to really create two purposes. One is, as Diane said, to offer some communication trainings in order to amplify messages. And as Diane said, I think it's really important that what the teams are doing is well understood and can be communicated to other to their own communities, but also to other communities, because I think the experience of real people working together in real communities inspires other communities. So again, it builds that bottom up, that bottom up energy. Right. The other part of our training is really the piece about how do you work transdisciplinary? We talk a lot about break down silos and work across different disciplines and work in community. It's very challenging to do that. And so one of the things that we have built into our training are opportunities to, one, spend time with your team. We have a 4-day in-person training in Boulder, Colorado, where the teams get some concentrated time with each other and then also with the other teams. And that networking, that sharing, that support, we really think is important to build teams that will flourish and will be able to do great things. So between the transdisciplinary training and the communications training, we think that's one way that we can make sure that our teams are able to really maximize their potential.
Absolutely. It's one thing to say that you're working in a transdisciplinary way. It's another to actually do it. So I love that. I know there are a lot of folks watching who are very interested in applying for this year's grant. And I'm wondering if you can give them some tips and what you're really looking for. Yeah.
So first of all, the grants are due, applications are due June 6th, and you can find all the information and even the examples, I believe, from our 4 original teams on Danone Institute NA.org. You'll see in there some of the specifics, but some of the specifics is that you have to show us that you have a transdisciplinary team. We want to see that you've got somebody from an academic institution, but it can be city government, it can be nonprofit. So a transdisciplinary team is an absolute essential. And we're also looking for proposals that really show that link between the health of the population and the health of the planet. So we've already had quite a lot of buzz and quite a lot of interest in the proposals, and we're really excited to see the group that we get this year.
That's great. Thank you so much, Leslie. And Diane, congratulations again on all the good work that you're doing. I know you're going to get lots more funding as the years go on, but congratulations. This has been a wonderful event. Thank you both so much. I want to thank all of the panelists for participating and our partners at the Danone Institute North America for collaborating on these important conversations. And I hope many of you watching and listening will apply for the One Planet, One Health Initiative Innovation Award. And again, you can find out more information by going to Danone Institute NA, DanoneInstituteNA.org. And we'll also be sharing today's conversation on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. Thanks again to everyone. Please stay safe and well, and check out that website, DanoneInstituteNorthAmerica.org. Thanks again.